Alrighty. Thank you so much, one, for the awesome turnout. I really know everyone has a lot of things to do, so I really appreciate you being here today. So again, it really means a lot that you came here and carved out time to hear Werner's story. My name is David Solovey. I'm Vice President of Skidmore College Republicans. Yeah, not many cheers, it's fine. I'm a junior from Seattle, Washington. I have also been involved in projects with the Office of Jewish Student Life, such as this one. When I took a gap year in Israel, I was taken on a trip to Poland. The trip was a harrowing experience. During this trip, a couple moments stood out. First was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, in front of the ruins of the gas chambers and crematorium, where more than 1 million people were murdered. These buildings were not the structures I had imagined. What was left of these buildings were just ruins and rubble. I did not know that they had been destroyed. When the SS thugs had left, they tried their best to destroy all evidence of their misdeeds. I stood angry that the walls were not still standing to tell their stories. When I went to Chelmno, one of the first extermination centers, I found that the gas tracks that had been used to murder Jews were gone. There were no barracks, no barbed wire fences, or anything to signify the atrocities that had happened there. All that was left to speak were the charred bone fragments still abundantly found in the soil. Ever since then, I've been on a journey to figure out how I can make those places speak. This journey has led me to today, where we have the chance to hear Mr. Werner Reich's testimony. We are all so very privileged that he has agreed to tell his story. It is a story of sorrow, survival, and witness. He is attempting to try to give voice to the millions who cannot tell their stories. To my fellow students, our children will not have the opportunity to hear firsthand accounts of the Holocaust. It is your opportunity to hear and pass on these stories to your children. It's also our job to learn not to be bystanders in the face of hate and bullying. However, this event would not be possible without a few of my mentors. I would like to thank Parker Diggory, our wonderful Director of Religious and Spiritual Life here at Skidmore. She has been instrumental in putting this lecture together. Before I recognize my second mentor, I want to give voice to also the Hillel E-Board, who does so much for the Jewish community. If you can just stand up real quick. Amazing. And I want to thank and introduce my mentor and partner of this project, Martina Zobel. She is the coordinator of Jewish Student Life here at Skidmore. Martina has worked so hard on this project and worked so hard for the Jewish students on this campus. But moving on, I wanted to, don't worry, I love you. So we have a very special message from Congressman Paul Tonko, who has sent a video to address this very lecture. So we're going to play that right now.
After more than 70 years since some of the most atrocious acts known to mankind, it is essential that we continue educating future generations on the Holocaust to ensure that this never happens again to any group of people anywhere in our world, as intolerance, anti-Semitism, bigotry, and forms of hate are promoted by hate groups. Holocaust education provides a context to learn about the danger of what can happen when hate goes unchallenged and there is indifference in the face of oppression of others. Learning how and why the Holocaust happened is an important component of the education of citizens of our great United States. We are now living in divisive times. It is more important than ever before that we are united by our common humanity.
Great, so Paul Tonko is actually going to be watching this video later, so everyone give him a round of applause, please. Thank you. Sweet. And I want to leave you with this before I introduce Martina. It's a quote I saw in the TV show The Outer Limits. It's, "The wounds of war run deep, cutting across generations. But there is always hope of healing, so long there are souls among us whose hearts are more full of love than hate." Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I guess you figured out I'm Martina Zobel, the coordinator of Jewish Student Life by now. It's really wonderful to see a crowd of both students and community members, faculty and staff. I want to, before I go any further, invite those of you who are standing to take a seat. So if you have an empty seat next to you, would you please raise your hand? And if you're standing, would you please be daring enough to sit next to a stranger? I have it on good authority, we have showers on campus. Okay, so I don't know if you use them. There's a few more seats in the front. Come on down, get comfy. So as you're taking your seats, David, I want to thank you for your words, but not just your words. I want to thank you for your dedication, for your enthusiasm, and your tireless commitment to bringing this opportunity to our program tonight. And you really are a blessing. We are grateful to the estate of Jacob Perlow for the generous grant that allows us to bring such diverse programming to campus. Jacob Perlow, much like our friend here, Werner Reich, was an immigrant to the United States. He was deeply interested in religion and philosophy. And so this program is a testament to that. Additionally, a gift was made by the Dolores Cole Educational Foundation to support tonight's program. Ms. Cole works hands-on through her foundation to make sure that enriching educational opportunities are offered across the United States. But more importantly, tonight we get to hear a first-hand account. Werner Reich's first-hand account. Werner Reich, apart from being a little salty and funny, is also an author, a father, a grandfather, a retired engineer, and a corporate executive. But before all of those accomplishments, he was a survivor. Mr. Reich, in his retirement, speaks to communities around the country and overseas, as far away as Hong Kong, as close as 3 miles from his hometown. He is both inspirational, as you will get in a moment, and pretty darn dynamic. He took his time, donated his energies to come here tonight, to travel, to share with us our story, so that each one of us can understand the dangers of indifference. Indifference kills. And how about the resilience of the human body? And maybe even more powerful, the human spirit. He has worked determinedly in this journey of sharing his story, but before that, he worked really determinedly to move from an immigrant in a foreign land, speaking in a foreign tongue, to get a degree that allowed him to take care of his family, to flourish, to thrive. And before that, he fled. He fled from Germany, from the heart of the Holocaust, to England, and from England to the United States. Today we are blessed. He isn't fleeing, but he drove to Skidmore College. Please raise your hands for Werner Reich.
Thank you very much. Over the years, I've been speaking in schools and also to adults, and I constantly came across certain issues that people brought up. I would say misunderstandings. and which sometimes even amongst the people cause great arguments. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to cover with you the 7 important facts we forget about the Holocaust. The first fact is that we do remember the 6 million Jews, how they were persecuted, locked up in various camps, and then killed and burned to death. But then we forget the fact that 3,000 Catholic priests were murdered, that 220,000 gypsies were lined up and shot, and about 270,000 people were murdered because of their mental deficiency, because they were handicapped, they were injected with gasoline, and they were placed sometimes into gas chambers. We also forget the 100,000 people who were no Jews, but were involved in being destroyed through revenge actions. Typical town would be Lidice, Czechoslovakia, where all the men were shot, 81 children were placed into vans, and exhaust fumes were piped in. 7 children were not placed in these vans. They had blonde hair, and they were given as gifts to some German families. All the women were placed into factories, and even the cemetery was dug up. We forget Ordures-sur-la-Glane, where 642 people were murdered, and the town was leveled. Or take Sant'Anna di Stracema in Italy, where 560 people were murdered, including 130 children. They were suspected of hiding resistance workers, and they put all these citizens into the basements of their buildings and then tossed in hand grenades. They, with machine guns, they killed a priest and a whole bunch of other people. They built a big bonfire from the pews of the church, and this whole job took 3 hours, and then they sat down and had lunch. We also forget the 2.6 million Russian prisoners of war who have been shot after they've been imprisoned. Altogether, we forget roughly 6 million people, over 6 million people who were part of the Holocaust. We forget Slovenes, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Spanish Republicans. So altogether, the Holocaust really amounted to 12 million dead, and not the traditional 6 million. We also forget that in order to control the Holocaust, in order to bring it to an end, 407,000 American soldiers died. 407,000 American soldiers without gaining 1 square inch of soil for the United States. Altogether, World War II, between 70 and 80 million people died. And finally, we forget, because of all of these huge numbers, that even one single victim is one person too many. Fact number 2. We remember that people were classified and then persecuted. Their homes were destroyed. They were sent to various concentration camps and killed. But we forget the fact that they also destroyed books and art We forget John Dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway, Franz Kafka, Jack London. A whole bunch of authors were banned, their books were burned. We forget that painters like Picasso or Van Gogh, their art was called degenerate art. Some of it was stolen by Hitler, and a lot of art from various houses of worship was robbed, and then these houses of worship were set on fire. We forget these things. The fact 3 is that we believe without Auschwitz there could not have been a Holocaust. We forget the 2 million Poles. We forget the Russian prisoners of war. By the way, Russian prisoners of war were used in Auschwitz to test poison gases to see which one works best and is most efficient in the gas chambers. We forget that in Auschwitz, we remember in Auschwitz 1.1 million people were murdered, but we forget the fact that the people in Auschwitz who were murdered consisted only of 9% of all the Holocaust victims. That's all. There was no need for Auschwitz. In Rwanda in 1994, the Hutu murdered 800,000 Tutsis without gas or guns. They used only clubs, knives, machetes. It took them 1 year, while a little bit more, 1,100,000, took the Germans 4 years. So Auschwitz was really not necessary. Fact 4 is we think that all Jews who died were from the East. They dressed in quaint clothing. They lived in little towns with a fiddler on the roof, and then were taken to ghettos, and from there to the gas chambers. But then we forget the fact that Jews were all over Europe. They were an important part of Germany's economy and culture. They owned huge department stores before even Americans thought about them, such as Wertheimer and Tietz. They were artists, merchants, businessmen. They were extremely well educated. Here are just 21 Jewish refugees from the Nazis who helped design the atom bomb, and 8 of them won Nobel Prize winners. German Jews were less than 1% of the population. Less than 1% of the population. German Jews were extremely loyal to Germany, extremely. Before World War I, German Jews amounted to 0.75% of the German population. Yet the German military consisted of 3% of Jews. In other words, 4 times more than you would have anticipated. So German Jews really couldn't even defend themselves, because for every 1 Jew, there were 133 Germans. It's not much of a fighting chance. So the question is, how did this country that produced intellectual and commercial supremacy drop to the level of complete moral and physical decay? In the 1930s, this how Germany looked. In the late 1920s, there was the crash of the stock markets, there was widespread unemployment, there was devaluation of money in Europe. In 1933, Hitler came to power, and Hitler blamed the racially impure for Germany's loss of World War I and its consequential economic status. And Hitler made a promise. He will restore Germany to its former glory and create a super Germany without the impure. So why did Hitler, of all the people, pick the Jews? Because Jews were a very, very good target. Everybody knew that Jews were money grabbers, poisoners of wells, cheats, cowards, child killers, sneaky Christ killers, usurers, exploiters, traitors, and suppressors of the world. So where did this knowledge come from? From a very simple book called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It was printed in the late 1880s in Russia, and it was an alleged plan to take over the world. In actuality, it was originally a caricature of Napoleon, which somebody in Russia had rewritten as an anti-Semitic book. The whole thing was a forgery, was a complete nonsense. Today, in the year 2019, this is one of the major pieces of literature that the white supremacist and anti-Semitic units distribute throughout the United States and the world. Obviously, all of these attributes are extremely difficult to remember. You can't remember child killers, well poisoners, and stuff like that. So the Germans came up with an extremely clever slogan called "The Jews are our misfortune." And whatever happened in your life, you could blame it onto the Jews, whether your roof was leaking, whether your wife ran away with the butcher, whether your boss fired you, whatever it was, blame the Jews. Like recently in Charlottesville, where you had people walking around and saying, you won't take our jobs. How the hell can 3% of American Jewry take 97% of all the jobs? I haven't got the slightest idea. But this is what we are dealing with. We are dealing with solid stupidity, which is merged into hate, and you can't argue with idiots. The Nazis had newspapers called like the Stürmer, and here you see the ritual murder and the murder of 10-year-old Gertrude Lenhoff. And here is a murder Jew. I love this picture because, frankly speaking, I realize I'm an old man and I've seen a lot, but I've never seen 10-year-old girls looking like that. Particularly, praying for mercy after the evil Jew already filled a huge goblet with their blood. Where do they get the energy from? I haven't got the slightest idea, but stick around. Jews were the only group of people who were publicly branded, if you will. No other group had to wear a sign or anything. And Jews had to wear a yellow star. In wherever country there was a yellow star, and then in the middle of the star there was, in the local language, the word Jew written. In addition to this, Jews had their passport stamped with the word J, with the letter J, and they got a new middle name. If you were a man, it was Israel, and if you were a woman, it was Sarah. And this is the way a Jewish passport looked like. As a strict aside, the Swiss were the first to stamp Jewish passports with a J, and then the Germans copied it. I have a particular love for the Swiss. They were the ones who bought all the dental gold from Auschwitz, and they were also the people who traded in stolen art. Anyway, fact number 5. We think that the Holocaust started with Kristallnacht, which was November 1938, Night of the Broken Glass. And during the night, the 7,000 businesses were destroyed, and cemeteries were turned over, and 1,700 houses of worship were burnt or vandalized, and 30,000 people were arrested, and within a month 1,000 were murdered. And all the insurance payments were confiscated by the German government, and then the Jews were fined for these Nazi riots, because the Nazis said, if it wouldn't have been for you Jews, we wouldn't have had to use the fire brigades to make sure that the non-Jewish homes next to the Jewish places which we set on fire wouldn't burn down. This to me is the sort of the highest point of chutzpah. I think it's a good definition of chutzpah, what the Nazis did. And we remember some of these things, but then we forget the fact that the first 6 months of Hitler's rules. We think of the Kristallnacht as being the point, but that was in November 1938. So why don't we go back to 1933 and go and see what happened during the first 6 months of Hitler's rules. On January 30th, Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany. Okay? 4 days later, on February 4th, he ordered the closing of Catholic newspapers. It was the first restriction, assault really, upon the citizens, strictly for, as far as I'm concerned, it was the start of the Holocaust. But Franz Gerlich, he was an editor of one of the Catholic newspapers 4 days after Hitler came to power, and he was murdered in Dachau. Not a Jew, by the way. Could this count as the start of the Holocaust? I don't know. I'm not telling you when the Holocaust started. I'll tell you when my Holocaust started, and you decide when you feel that that was the start of the Holocaust. We go back to February 28th, that is less than a month after Hitler came to power, and this is the burning down of the German parliament, of the Reichstag. And with it came out laws which prevented people from speaking, publicly eliminating the safety of your home and invading your privacy. And they also had the freedom of search without a warrant. In other words, anybody could walk into your home and just search the place and even arrest you without a warrant. And a legal system where all the laws favor the government is obviously inhumane. And as I said, the homes were ransacked. Now the question to you is, and answer it to yourself, not to me, could this count as the start of the Holocaust? We go to month 2. We come now to the opening of the Dachau concentration camp. Could this count as the start of the Holocaust? I don't know. We come to month 3. We have a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. They boycotted Jewish stores. They boycotted stores that they thought were Jewish. Woolworths was not Jewish, but they boycotted. They stood outside. They boycotted doctors' offices, lawyers' offices, real estate, whatever. If you assume that the Holocaust started with the death of people caused by the Nazi movement, you may want to consider this particular event as the start of the Holocaust, because roughly 300 Jews had committed suicide as a result of this boycott. 300. So, could this count as the start of the Holocaust? It's up to you. And then we have, in month 3, we also have, towards the end of the middle of the month, Jews were banned from civil service jobs, universities, and teaching. They were simply fired because they were Jews. And then there came a rather insidious law, which says laws against overcrowding of schools. So if you feel that your school is overcrowded, then all you do is you eliminate those you cannot carry. Surprise! It's the Jews. So you have scenes like this in schools, where 2 Jewish students have to stand next to a blackboard, and somebody had written on the blackboard, "The Jews are our biggest enemy." This particular picture gives me the creeps, because I look at all the students and the teacher looking at the blackboard, and these 2 students have been abandoned. I cannot in my mind imagine how they must have felt. Anyway, could this be the start of the Holocaust? I don't know. And then we come to month 4, which is the public burning of books by Jewish, foreign, and many German authors, something that I mentioned before. In other words, books that are considered un-German were simply tossed in the flames and burned. Heinrich Heine, the German Jewish poet, said exactly 100 years before, "Where one burns books, one also burns people." And he was unfortunately right. Anyway, the question which I'm addressing to you is simply this: was this the start of the Holocaust? And then we have in month 6, remember month 6, I'm not talking about years, I'm talking month 6. The laws permitting forced sterilization of gypsies, the mentally and physically disabled, African Germans, and other considered inferior. It was the Rhineland bastards. They were children of black soldiers and white women. As Hitler said, these children are the result of either a black man raping a white woman or a woman being a whore. That's how these people have been represented. According to the law, 400,000, just think of the number, 400,000 people were determined to be sterilized. Could this count as the start of the Holocaust? I don't know, it's again entirely up to you. All I know is that with the start of 1933, when Jews were deprived of their livelihood, safety and schooling, my Holocaust started. That was roughly 5 years before Kristallnacht. My father was a mechanical and electrical engineer, and we lived in Berlin, Germany, and one of the first laws that the Nazi movement came out with was deprive Jews of their livelihood. If they can't eat, they have to run away, they have to go somewhere. And so the law came out in 1933 that Jews could not work in hospitals, schools, colleges, or corporations. My sister and I, we couldn't go to school, and so we left Germany and went 3 countries away. We went to Yugoslavia, and we thought we would be safe there. And that's a picture of my sister and myself in 1933. I used to be adorable. I haven't changed too much, but anyway. We immediately run into some serious problems. Number one, the country didn't need any engineers because it was strictly agricultural. They didn't need any. Just to give you an idea, 75% of the country was illiterate. That was 1933. And then we had to learn 2 new languages, Croat and Serbian. And my parents never did. And my parents were always annoyed when my sister and I spoke to each other in Croat. And they didn't know what was going on. So, revenge of the children. We lived in a beautiful town, Zagreb. And once in a while we went on vacation to the mountains or down to the Adriatic Sea. And this is a picture of myself when I was about 11 years old. I don't have any other pictures. I think I have 1 or 2 more, and that's about it. In the meantime, Germany kept occupying more and more countries around Yugoslavia. And we tried to get out from the country, and we applied, and the other countries simply said no. Some countries wanted huge bribes, like the United States consul. They wanted huge, enormous numbers, and we didn't have it. We lost everything when we left Germany. We had to leave, and even the money that we took out of the country, I think something like 30% or so was taken in exit taxes by the German government. And anyway, in 1940, my father died, and a couple of months later, Germany invaded Yugoslavia, and the part where I lived came under the ruling of Dr. Ante Pavelic. And Pavelic was a top-line Nazi. He was really a Nazi worthy of the name. He was extremely cruel. Here's a typical poster. Now, this is a poster which says, "He who does not drink a liter of Serbian blood is not a Croat. May God be with the Croats." I mean, can you imagine, let's say, an American president says, "He who does not drink 2 pints of Mexican blood is not a true American"? I mean, we can't even imagine anything like that. And yet, he didn't say this only, but this is a poster. This is actually a poster printed, and that's it. Jews had to wear a yellow star with the letter Ž for Židov, and We also had to wear a star, as you can see, on the front and also on the back. He immediately opened a concentration camp called Jasenovac. Altogether, there were 7 extermination camps in Europe. 6 of them were in Poland. Notice that not one single extermination camp was in Germany, but they were in Poland, because the Poles were anyway on the bottom of the list of desirable people. And the 7th one was in Yugoslavia. It was in Jasenovac, where about 200,000 people had been murdered by either starvation or having their throats cut with knives like this. In one town in Kragujevac, a couple of German soldiers were shot by the resistance, so they went to a local school and they took 200 students, they marched them out of town, and they shot them. In Glina, which was another town, they took all the men and brought them to the local Serbian Orthodox church, and they took a picture of them. And here's the picture. And 2 minutes later, they were all shot, and the church was set on fire, and that was that. There were constantly soldiers all over the sidewalks, and if you walked with a yellow star, you couldn't be on the sidewalk, you had to step into the gutter. My mother was afraid that something would happen to me, so she placed me with a couple who worked for the resistance. I was at that time 13 years old, and for the next 2 years I couldn't wear shoes because the people in the apartment below would hear me. I couldn't go near the windows because people from the street would see me, and I developed films. I made enlargements, I made copies, did all photographic work. I was 15 years old when there was a knock at the door, and a bunch of Gestapo agents walked in. And they turned the place upside down. Everything that was in the closets was taken out and thrown on the floor. And then they arrested the couple, and they arrested me too. And they took me down to their headquarters. I was lucky it was the Gestapo, because if the Ustaše, if the Croats would have arrested me, they would have cut my throat. And they took me down to headquarters. And then they beat the living daylights out of me. They questioned me. And it didn't make any difference what I answered. The guy hit me. I don't know, I was crying and bleeding all over his place. His mother must have been very proud of him. Anyway, so there I was, not knowing even what was going on. Now, I'd like to point out one thing to you, and particularly the younger generation. I didn't know anything about the Holocaust. I didn't know how cruel or how bad the Nazis were. I didn't have the slightest idea that these people were able and willing to kill. I didn't know what a concentration camp was. You're going to say to yourself, this guy must have been an idiot. But I wasn't, because the newspapers were government-controlled, and they didn't publish any of that stuff. They were government-friendly, and the government-friendly newspapers, you know, those who were friendly with Germany, or the German newspapers, or Yugoslav newspapers, certainly did not, wouldn't say that their government is beating the living daylights out of it, and the government would have forbidden it. My parents were Victorians. They were born in the 1880s, 1890. And they believed that children are to be seen or not heard. And whenever a serious conversation came up, the children were sent out of the room. And so I had absolutely no knowledge. I didn't know why we left Germany. You know, so we just left Germany. We came to Yugoslavia. Fine, as a kid, it didn't bother me. I didn't realize we were escaping. I didn't know who the Gestapo was. I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't know what a concentration camp was until I was in one. And obviously was slightly late at that point. Anyway, the guy beat me up, and then they locked me up in a basement cell that had nothing in it. Just there was a concrete cell. There was no bed, no chair. It was only a bucket to be used as a toilet. And I was there for 3 days, and they just gave me liverwurst sandwiches. I just wondered at one point, how long can one live on liverwurst sandwiches? Who knows? And after 3 days, I was shipped to a border town between Croatia and Slovenia. And there I was locked up in a little wooden shed, which must have been a drunk tank or what, which was filled with with millions of fleas. They got into my hair, into my ears, into my nose. It was terrible. I was wearing short-sleeved shirt. It was springtime, and short pants, and my body got swollen. And from there, after 3 days, I was shipped to Graz, Austria, and I found myself in this building, which still today is the police station in Graz, Austria. And I was locked up on the 3rd floor in the back of the building with 3 other kids. 2 kids had been arrested for burglary, and the 3rd kid had murdered his mother. And I was the 4th criminal there. And I was there for 6 weeks. And that's where I had my only revenge on the German government, because I infected that cell and the adjacent cells with fleas. One day I looked out of the window into the police station yard, and I saw my mother walking around in a circle with some other women. And that's the last time I ever saw my mother. From there I traveled to Vienna, the city of my dreams. And I spent the night in this absolutely gorgeous synagogue. Except by the time I came there, it didn't look like this anymore, it looked like this. It was destroyed during the night of the broken glass. There was glass and water and soot and dirt, and I had a great, great difficulty finding a place where to sleep. And the next day, I and 120 other people were loaded into a train with seats, and we traveled for 2 days. We traveled to Czechoslovakia. And there we found ourselves in a place called Terezin. If you look at the thickness of the wall and the height of the wall and the shape of the wall, you will realize this was not an ordinary place, but it was a fortress built about 1780, about 180 years before, 150 years before. And when planes were invented, the fortresses became useless because all you do is you just fly over them and drop a couple of bombs and it's curtains. So the military moved out and civilians moved in, and about 2,900 civilians lived there very happily and in harmony. And then when the Nazis moved into Czechoslovakia, they said this is a perfect place for a concentration camp. So they threw the 2,900 people out and replaced them with about 60,000 Jews. But not regular Jews, but Jewish intelligentsia from Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria, because the camp was made into an exhibit camp. You see, the Swiss authorities and the Swedish authorities, and the Red Cross in particular, complained to the German government that they feel that they are mistreating the Jews, and Jews have to be treated just like prisoners of war, according to the Geneva Convention. And the Nazis felt pressured by them. Why? I haven't got the slightest idea. Anyway, and they said, look, we will show you that we are really nice people. So what they did is they gave these people their crayons and musical instruments and freedom to do whatever they wanted to do, even do their own governing, which sounded very nice and fine. Of course, they couldn't leave, and they had lousy food, and they were overcrowded. So every time an inspection was announced, they had to solve the problems of food and overcrowding. Food was easy. All they did is they shipped in some good food. Overcrowding was more difficult, but they solved it ingeniously. They simply took people from there, put them on a train, and shipped them to Auschwitz. 141,000 people were shipped to Terezin. 17,000 survived. Anyway, I was in there. So they had converted it into a concentration camp, and there were hundreds and thousands of these all over. Some people think that the Germans started with the first concentration camps that they had during Hitler's era. But those of you who think thusly are wrong. Between 1903 and 1907, Germany had concentration camps in Africa, in what's now Namibia, on Shark Island. And the first governor, and this is totally useless information, but there you have it, was a man called Heinz Ernst Goering. He was the father of Hermann Goering. And I like his uniform. I think the son must have inherited the love for fancy and strange uniforms. And this is what they did to their prisoners. They put in metal rings round their necks, and they starved them to death. This is the way Terezin looked. It was old and dilapidated. And this is where we slept. This is where we washed ourselves. And this is how we arrived. Actually, we didn't arrive like this until I came. I helped lay these railroad tracks. I also worked in the mud outside the fortress, cutting willow branches and making baskets out of them. So if anybody needs a basket, you can leave me your name afterwards. I exterminated vermin from the buildings, taping up the windows, and then using cyclone gas, which was cyanide gas. The Nazis tried to use these pellets in Auschwitz, but it was too slow. So they developed a special poison called Cyclone B, which was prussic acid. This was cyanide and the other one was prussic acid. And anyway, I was there in beautiful Terezin for 10 months. And after 10 months, there was obviously an inspection coming up, and they brought in a bunch of railroad cars just like these. They loaded us up, 100 people per car. They put in a bucket, and then they closed the door, and off we went on a 3-day train ride. We didn't know where we were going. The buckets overflowed after an hour, and people were dying, people were throwing up, and we were lying in our feces and urine. And when we arrived, we were immediately faced by a group of SS men and people in striped uniforms. We didn't have the slightest idea where we were or what was going on. And if you look at the picture carefully, every one of these guys has a walking stick. And they were beating us with these sticks over the head, over the shoulders, in the face. People were lying on the ground, screaming, crying, bleeding. It was like a scene out of hell. The SS men had a standard SS caps, but their uniform was different. Instead of having the SS arrows on their lapel, they had a skull and crossbone. This was what is known as the Sonderkommando by the SS, which were people who were strictly assigned to concentration camp duties. Behind us there was a gate, underneath us was mud, and next to us was electrically charged barbed wire. So we asked, where are we? And somebody told us, you're in Auschwitz too, Birkenau. Which was an extermination camp. Never heard of Auschwitz, never heard of Birkenau, never heard of extermination camp. Actually, there were 3 Auschwitz camps there. There was Auschwitz I, which was strictly for German criminals. They emptied German penitentiaries of murderers. By the way, Germany didn't have a death penalty for murderers. They only had it for innocent people. They had murderers there, rapists, child molesters, you name it. The dregs of society, people who spent already years in penitentiaries, they were brought there to act as guards inside the other 2 concentration camps. There was Auschwitz III, which was a small factory, which was 5 miles from the Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II camp. And Auschwitz II was the camp where, if you talk about Auschwitz, that's where the camp people are talking about. That's where the gas chambers were and the ovens and so on. This is the way Auschwitz looked. Auschwitz II, everybody arrived at the green spot at the bottom, and then people were sorted out as they entered the camp. Either complete transports were immediately sent to the red spots. That's where the gas chambers were in the ovens. The black spot in between on the left-hand side, that's where the barracks were. They were called Canada. That's where all the merchandise that the people brought with them, because the Nazis, whenever they loaded people for Auschwitz, they said, you are being resettled. In the broadest sense of the word, they were correct. But they brought with them beds, pillows, clothing, jewelry, silverware, and they also, obviously, the clothing of the people after they were killed. That's always sorted there in the area which was called Canada. The area above the green spot, there were 6 smaller camps. They held anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 people each, sometimes 6,000. They were, at the time when I was there, one camp was strictly for Jehovah's Witnesses, and one was for gypsies. And while I was there, both camps were exterminated completely. The area below the green spot is the women's camp, and the area with the blue spot, that's where the Nazis had their barracks. That's where the Nazis lived. Now, the distance between Auschwitz III, which was the factory that made artificial rubber, and this camp was 5 miles. It would have been 1 minute by plane to fly and drop a bomb. While they bombed Auschwitz III, the Buna, the artificial rubber factory, because it was a contributor towards the German war effort. This was a civilian camp, and not one single bomb ever fell on the gas chambers, on the railroad tracks, or on the German barracks. And if you think I'm bitter about it, you're damn right. This is the way the camp looked. And this is the way we looked. And we had a triangle and a number on our uniform. And depending why you were in the camp, that's how the triangle was colored. If you were a political prisoner, it was red, gay, pink, Jehovah's Witness purple, gypsies black, Jews yellow, and thieves and murderers light and dark green. And we also got a tattoo on our arms. And this is the way women looked. And this is a typical barrack in which we stayed. There were bags made out of very, very coarse material, like sack material, and with straw lying on top of these wooden bars. And these sacks were soaked with urine and with feces. And there were 6 people on each level. 3 people sleeping in one direction, 3 people sleeping in the other direction. So you always had somebody's feet in your face. Sometimes the top level would fall on the middle, and the middle on the lower level, and kill the people on the lower level. This is a woman's barrack after liberation. Half the people were gone by this time. They went on a death march. This is a man's barrack after liberation, and here again, this is a man's barrack after liberation. The man in the middle has the only 2 properties that we had, a bowl and a spoon. And the bowl was filled in the morning with some brown water made out of acorns, and we also got a piece of bread made out of flour and sawdust, a slice of bread. For lunch we got a soup which was, I don't know why I'm calling it soup, but I haven't been able to find another term for it yet. I can't even call it swill. It was salt water into which a few tiny little pieces of unwashed turnips or potatoes had been cut. And the general, when you lined up for the food, there was always constantly hollering, from the bottom, so you get at least some potatoes in it, because from the top there was nothing there. And the potatoes, they hadn't been washed. There was sand and grit, dirt at the bottom. And eating that food created a couple of problems. The first problem was that you didn't have any vitamins and you lost your teeth. And the second problem was that you got dysentery and you had to walk through this mud and get to this toilet. And you could spend a couple of minutes there and then you were chased away. There was no toilet paper there. 3 times a day we had to stand between the barracks and be counted. And there was, if somebody was missing, you had to stand there for hours in snow, sleet, rain, ice, whatever it was. Didn't make any difference. You just stood there and until the person could be found. Usually they were either dead or they were sleeping somewhere. If you didn't stand in line properly, they had a judicial system that worked extremely efficient. You were sentenced to some beating with a stick. And that sentence was immediately executed within 5 minutes or so. They had a bench there, which was typical for most camps. You put your feet in the 2 holes, you leaned over the bench, and then one prisoner criminal held you by the arms, and the other criminal beat you with a stick. I've seen people dying on this thing. I once got 15 strokes and I didn't think I'll make it. This is a demonstration for General Eisenhower and George Patton and Omar Bradley. And as I said, if they couldn't find the person, you had to do what the Germans jokingly called sport. They were always full of fun, these Nazis. And for instance, you had to do leapfrog jumping until a few people were dead. There was no way that you could escape from the camp. Let me put it to you this way. 1,300,000 people came to Auschwitz. Exactly 2 people successfully escaped. That's it, finished. And they had escaped. There were 2 Slovak freedom fighters, resistance fighters, who were soldiers, and they managed to get to England because once they were in Slovakia, there was somehow moved out to England. They came to England and they met with a group of ministers and military men. They said, please, please, bomb the damn place. And some of these ministers jumped up and said, no, 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 don't. Somebody might get hurt. Back to the drawing board. Anyway, there was no way you could escape from Auschwitz. There were electrically charged barbed wires, there were guard towers, there were German shepherds that had been trained to run after prisoners and tear them apart. When the Russians liberated Auschwitz, all these dogs were shot immediately. And when somebody tried to escape, they caught them and then they brought them back and they put a big, cardboard sign around their necks. Hooray, hooray, I'm back again. And then if they were lucky, they were hanged. If they were not lucky, they found some punishment for them. One guy tried to escape, so they took a barrel and they hammered nails from the outside of the barrel into the barrel. They put the man in the barrel and they rolled it down a hill. I once had to watch how two men were beaten to pulp with long barrel poles. And I say pulp, I mean pulp. Many people couldn't take the camp, so they just committed suicide. They just threw themselves against the wire. And every day the power was turned off for about half an hour. And the bodies were removed, and then the power was turned back on. It's during that period that the power was off that if anybody tried to escape, that's when they tried to escape, but didn't work. This is one of the 4 crematoria there, and this is a typical gas chamber into which the people were jammed with their arms raised high. This way you get more people in than if the arms are low. And then little children were thrown on top of them, and through this hole in the ceiling, the Cyclone B gas, the one with the prussic acid, was dropped in. And when the people were dead, a special group of prisoners, also called Sonderkommando, who lived separately, had to go in there and remove the bodies. These prisoners worked there exactly 6 months in the gas, in these, and then they themselves were sent, were gassed. I can never imagine what it must be like to know that in exactly 6 months I'm going to be killed, and there's nothing I can do. And I have to work here under these conditions. I know one case where a man had to burn his own wife. They burnt the bodies in these ovens, and they also burnt them outside in pits. And the only thing that remained of these people were boxes full of wedding rings, glasses, shoes, clothing, empty suitcases. People ask me sometimes, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you while you were in the camp? I was 16 at that time, and I didn't have the slightest idea from one day to the next when I'm going to be alive. The air was constantly filled with the smell of burning hair and burning flesh. It was a time in 1944 when they brought all the Hungarian transports there. And it may sound obscene, what I'm going to say now, but as long as transports came and they were burning them, they couldn't burn us. It was one of those situations where, when you think from an ethical point of view, it was just about the worst approach you can take. But that's the truth. One day Dr. Mengele came in the camp. Dr. Mengele had a PhD in anthropology, and he had an MD. He was Hitler's expert on race, and he conducted many experiments on twins and on dwarfs. He was also affectionately known as the Angel of Death. And there was Dr. Mengele standing with a group of SS men telling jokes. It was selection time. And all the young people in the camp, all the young boys, and there was nobody under 12, between 18 and 12, we all had to strip naked and we had to run past Dr. Mengele. And there he stood and occasionally nodded his head or moved his finger or whatever else, and somebody went to the other side. And this went on, and by the time he was finished with it, there were roughly 300 of us on one side. And we had to run again, and then there were 200, and eventually there were 89. And the 89 of us, we were told to put our clothes back on, and we went to another camp, adjacent, one of these smaller adjacent camps. And in the back of our barrack, which was the penalty barrack, there were the camp gallows. And I spent a lot of time sitting on these gallows. Over the next 5 days, with the exception of a couple of hundred other people, the remaining 5,000 people in the camp were sent to the gas chambers. Of the 89, when the war was over, there were only 46 of us still alive. Today there are maybe a dozen. Anyway, I was sent to Auschwitz I, where the criminals were. And I worked in the stables. Came Christmas time, 1944, I had to be, we were eating in a large dining room. And this was, remember, these were criminals. And they had a dining room. In Auschwitz too, there was no such thing as a dining room. There was nothing there. And I recall SS officer jumping on one of the tables and saying, "Gentlemen, Germans, I have good news for you. You know, you are going to be put in uniforms and go to the Russian front." And those of us who were not Germans, and there was a small number of us who had been assigned there, you know, we wanted to cheer. You know, it was great, you know. And these poor guys, that's the last thing they wanted to do, go to the Russian front, you know, and fight. So it was a sort of a funny atmosphere. And they were all sent there to the front lines and immediately shot by the Russians. Couldn't have happened to a nicer group of people. Anyway, came January 1945, a month later, and we heard the Russian shooting and bombing and so on, and we'll be liberated. Like hell. They took 60,000 of us in the snow, and we started on a death march. We started, I think it was January 16th, we started that death march. And Auschwitz was liberated January 27th. Every time I think of that, I get mad. I get really, and you'll see in a moment why. Anyway, we left on this death march and we walked, and it was a death march. We walked through mud and snow and ice. We had no food. We only had snow and ice to eat. After 2 hours we stopped, and those who couldn't get up were shot. And we continued like that throughout the day. And we slept in a, how do you call it, in a stable the first night. And then we continued the next day. By this time, people had no energy. They stripped themselves, their clothes off, because it was too heavy. There were bodies all over the place. We slept in a silo the second night, and the third day, we arrived at some railroad siding. We had walked 35 miles, and of the 60,000, 15,000 were dead. 15,000 bodies spread over 35 miles. I mean, you know, when I think of these numbers and so on, it's just, you know, I can't understand it. And the temperatures were low. It was the coldest winter on record in the 20th century. The temperatures never, ever went above zero. And then we were loaded into open railroad cars. If you think it's cold, moving outside in the fresh air, you haven't lived until you've been solid standing in an open railroad car that moves in the winter. We were chilled completely to the bone and inside. We had no decent clothes. Our clothes were like dishcloth. We had no fat on ourselves. There was no temperature. It was unbelievable. And we traveled under the guardianship of young 14-year-old kids with guns. And whenever somebody died, we just took the body and we dumped them out on the side of the railroad car. And we traveled like that for 4 days, from Poland all the way to Austria. And over half the people in the train were dead. And then we arrived in Mauthausen, which was a concentration camp from hell. They had a quarry there with 186 steps. And the Nazis had a very funny game there called parachute jumping without a parachute. They had to prisoners had to push each other off the cliff into the valley. They were stripped naked in the winter and sprayed with water. We limped through this gate and we came into the yard and then were showered. And we collapsed, screaming with pain. It was the most excruciating pain that I ever had in my entire life. All of us were frostbitten. Some people died on the spot. After 3 days, my feet started to rot. And there was a Serbian prisoner of war who somehow got some, who was a doctor, and he had some knives or what, and he cut off my toes on one foot, part on the other foot, and that's how he saved my life. And then things got bad. We were surrounded by mud, and then Russia and came from one side and United States from the other side. And we were squeezed in between and had no food. We had been abandoned by the SS, and nobody locally would come in. This is how we looked. This is what he has on his legs are feces, not mud. And this is how the majority of the people looked. And then the Americans came and they liberated us. When I was liberated, I was 17 years old and I weighed 64 pounds. And then they gave us military rations, and we ate these rations, and 20,000 people died. I ate a can of chewing tobacco. I didn't know what I ate, you know. No, I mean, look, it was this close. If I would have been liberated 2 days later, I wouldn't be sitting here. And then they called in the local population, they picked up the bodies, and they simply buried them in mass graves. I was given a little piece of paper and said, go home. And like a jerk, I hitchhiked back to Yugoslavia, which was a huge mistake. I came back to Yugoslavia, looked nice to me, except that there were communists there. And I had no family there. I had no friends. I had nothing. As a matter of fact, those of us who had been in the camps, we were sort of looked down upon because we weaseled out of fighting with the resistance movement. We were hiding in concentration camps instead of fighting for the freedom of the people. I was there for 2 years, and then I don't know why I kept this stupid thing, but anyway, I went to England. And when I came to England, I had a couple of problems. I had no schooling. I had no skills. The only skill I had was I could swear in 7 different languages. And there was absolutely no demand for that. And I couldn't speak English. So I started working as a laborer. I became a machine tool fitter, then a tool and die maker. I got married and I came to the United States. I went to college for 10 years at night, and that's that. Fact number 6 is that we think that the Germans did all the killing. Whenever we speak about the Holocaust, the Germans said this, the Germans said that, the Germans said the other. But then we forget one simple fact, that every single nation, with the exception of Bulgaria, contributed collaborator killing units. How enthusiastic were these various nations? Extremely. Let's look at it this way. In Germany, 25% of the Jews were killed. In Poland, 90%. Should give you some idea. Even Denmark had SS troops. The fact number 7 is we think that nearly all the killers were brought to justice, that things turned out fine. We know that Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels committed suicide. Goebbels killed himself, his wife, and his 6 children. But then we forget the fact, and that's an important fact, that roughly 9,000 Nazis had escaped to South America through the Odessa organization. South American dictators sold Germany visas, 9,000 of them. Amongst them was Dr. Mengele, who accidentally drowned on a beach in Brazil in 1978. So how could the Holocaust have been avoided? By hearing the voice of the majority. But the majority was silent. George Bernard's Shaw aptly said, "Indifference is the essence of inhumanity." They were watching how the Jews were scrubbing the sidewalks, and they were looking down at the ground, and then they looked up in the sky and saw how their bodies floated in the smoke over them, but nobody said anything. Many people quoted the Holocaust, but I don't think anybody said it better than the late Dr. Martin Luther King, when he said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." He was right. I can't really remember what Hitler or Goering has said, but I can still hear the sound of the doors slamming into our face. In closing, think of your own actions and what you will do when you see something is wrong. Please, don't be a silent friend. Never again. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. You have been amazingly attentive. The silence in here was the kind of silence of respect and honor. It is late, and I don't want to hold people that need to go and finish homework assignments or go to bed so they can teach classes tomorrow. But I know that some of you might have questions, so I'm happy to take 1 or 2 questions, and then maybe we'll have the reception outside, yes? And if people want to ask Werner questions, as long as you don't torture him for too long, it's been a long evening. So are there a few questions before we break? Do you want to say something? Just one question? So can you stand up and shout your question out?
I just wonder what happened with your sister.
What happened with my sister? My sister was placed with another family, and after a year they said, look, it's getting too dangerous for us. Bye-bye. And they tossed her out, and she didn't know what to do, so she escaped to Italy. Because Italy always had a very, very good relationship with Jews. Mussolini's girlfriend was Jewish, just to give you an idea. And so she escaped to Italy. She was arrested, placed in a detention camp in Italy, and was there for a year, was liberated by the British. And then she stayed on in Italy for a few more years, came to the United States, and when I got married, we got reunited. She died in 1999. Of course, it was a different relationship, you know, it was a sort of a strange thing. When we parted, I was 13 and she was 17, you know, or 12 and 16. And, you know, she was the big sister and I was the pain in the behind. You know, so, you know, little brother and big sister. And when we met, we were both married and both adults, and we had a completely different relationship. It was a very mature, very, very good, very sound relationship. We never, as adults, we never had any arguments. Both of us knew what life was about, you know, and we felt that, you know, most of the stuff that you argue isn't really worth arguing about. Thank you for asking.
Last question.
I was just wondering if you have visited Poland or Yugoslavia.
Can you ask that again? Sorry.
Have you visited Poland since, and if you have, how did you feel going back?
Have you visited Poland since then? And if you have, how did you feel about going back?
I have not visited Poland again because Auschwitz doesn't exist anymore. You know, it's Auschwitz was #1 mud. It was fear. It was the smell of burning hair and burning flesh. It was bodies. It was hopelessness. It was a picture in gray and white. And it doesn't exist anymore. I've seen pictures of it, beautiful grass and so on. when we were there, we would have eaten all that grass. That grass would not existed. You know, it's all. I tell you what happened to me about 2 months ago. I've seen lots of movies. I have a bunch of movies about the concentration camp, including Schindler's List, and I said to myself, I wish I would have been in a camp like this. You know, it looked all very nice and fine because they were in color, and I can't remember the Auschwitz. Auschwitz to me, because we were underfed and underdressed. To me, Auschwitz was always cold, shivering, and I was there in the summer and in the fall, and it's miserable in Poland up there. And recently, about 2 months ago, I saw a movie that was made by a couple of women who had been in Auschwitz, and they used the original Auschwitz uniforms, and the film was filmed in 1946 in Auschwitz. And while Auschwitz was still mud, and this whole movie the movie had been banned. And I saw the movie. Actually, what happened was I saw the first 5-6 minutes of the movie. And the first 5-6 minutes of the movie consisted of the first minute, there was a pregnant woman in the camp. I don't know how she got in there. And she was about to give birth. And there was a body count, you know, daily body count. And all the women had to line up outside, and there was one person obviously missing. And typically they had to stand there in the rain until the person could be found. And the women were standing in the Auschwitz uniforms in the mud, in the original Auschwitz mud, in the original Auschwitz rain, and the movie was taken in black and white. And I watched it for about 3 minutes. And I suddenly got so sick that I had to leave the room, and I nearly vomited. Suddenly all the fear and everything that had been stored up in me suddenly came out again. It was the first time since I left Auschwitz some 75 years before. I thought I had it all forgotten, but it suddenly came back. And that is the Auschwitz that doesn't exist anymore, and never will, I hope.
Again, Werner Reich, you have honored each of us, and we will carry this story forward. We will not be silent. Please join us for a dessert reception upstairs, and feel free to ask Mr. Reich questions when we're upstairs. You made a difference.